Well, hey guys, today I'm going to be working on my Deuce and a half. I took it out to a little car rally this weekend, and when I parked it, I was getting a drip out of my bell housing. This is the top of the inspection plate. You can see there's oil in it. Usually that indicates a rear main seal leak. I replaced a rear main seal less than 1,000 miles ago when I put a new clutch and pressure plate, rebuilt my transmission. But it appears it's leaking again, so I've got to go down and investigate and see what's going on. So I've got to pull the transmission back out. This is looking at the transmission from inside. I've got the tunnel cover taken off. I was hoping it was going to be something simple like a valve cover leak or something dripping down on here, but as you can see, that's dry and dusty, so nothing simple. So I've got to pull the transmission out. I'm going to have to pull drop the phone. I'm going to have to pull the transmission tunnels off. I got the two covers off here. I've got to pull the two off here so that I can get to the jack shaft behind the transmission that goes to the transfer case. I've got to take off my front drive shaft down there. I've got to take off the PTO drive shaft on this side. Then I can unbolt the transmission and drop it down to the floor and be able to get to the rear main seal. I've also got to take out my seats so that I can have a little more room in here to work. So I've got a pretty good amount of work to get done. Should only take a couple hours. Naturally, everything's big and heavy, but I should be able to knock it out. And I'll show you progress along the way. But that's the plan today. I've talked to my buddy Garrett, and he kind of confirms that it's pretty much the rear main. He said it also could be the rear main carrier. I hope it's not that. There's a gasket that goes behind that, and if that's the case, I've got to take off the bell housing, and that means removing the starter, which is not that big a deal. But then I've got to recenter the bell housing on the engine to the crank using a dial indicator, and that may be a little difficult to do with a big heavy piece like that in the position it's in. So I'm hoping I don't have to do that, but that's the way it goes. So anyway, I'll be pulling that back apart, and I'll show you the progress. Okay guys, you can see I've got the seats out. Had to use my engine crane to get those out. Those things are heavy. At least they're heavier than my little ass can pick up. So I had to fold those up and get them out the door with the crane. As you can see, the transmission's there. I got all the transmission tunnel covers off. I have 3 transmission tunnel covers because I extended the cab and have a back seat. So I've got a third one back here. Gives me a lot more room. I can actually access the park and brake and all that if I need to. So that's the front drive shaft. It goes to the transfer case to the front axle. I have to take that off so that I can get to the bolts here on the jack shaft, which is the shaft that comes from the transmission to the transfer case. And then there's a PTO shaft you can kind of see up in there. Runs from the PTO on the side of the transmission up to the winch. So that has to come out too, because the transmission has to drop down. So to get the transmission to drop down fully, I have to take the cover off because the shifter handle is so tall it won't come out from under the truck. It may if I roll it around, but I'm just going to take the cover off, and then I'll put a piece of cardboard over top of it to keep any debris from falling up in there. And then what I'll do is I'll put a 4x4 from the windshield to the back glass and put a chain fall here and hook it to the transmission and lower the transmission down to the floor. And that way I'll be able to get to in here where the bell housing is and get to the rear seal and whatnot. So the first thing I got to do is take out that drive shaft and then the PTO shaft, and then I'll work on the jack shaft. And the jack shaft is a lot of trouble usually because these bolts are tough to get to. The reason I'm taking out the front drive shaft is to get to these bolts, and it gives you a little more room when you drop a transmission. So that'll be a problem. Of course, I have to disconnect the, the linkage here, and well, I don't know about the linkage yet to the transfer case, but certainly the clutch linkage, which is right there. You can see that where the linkage goes for the clutch disconnect. So I disconnect that, and then I should be able to pull it back out and drop it down. Now we'll see how it goes, guys. Okay, guys, I got the jack shaft out. It was a pain, as I anticipated. It always is. You can't really get an impact to all of the bolts. You can get an impact to the front ones. Garrett says you can get a 3/8 impact in there. I was able to get one of them out with a 3/8 impact, but my Milwaukee 3/8 impact wouldn't get the rest of them, so I had to use a double wrench deal, and that's always a hassle. I'm draining the oil out of the transmission now so that I can take the top cover off and lower it down. And, taking the oil out, I won't make a big mess. I got both of the other shafts out. I got the front drive shaft out. I got it wired up hanging there. I got the PTO shaft hanging there. See it right by the light there. And got the PTO shifter lever disconnected. I got the clutch arm disconnected. So the next thing I'll be doing is taking the top cover off. And like I said, I'm going to cut a piece of cardboard and bolt that on there just to keep any debris out of it. And I'll hook my chains to these bolts and I'll lower it down. Got to take out those bolts there on the bell housing. And we'll lower it to the ground, and we'll start taking off the clutch, pressure plate, and flywheel and see what we have. All right, guys, I'm just about ready to loosen the rest of the bolts on the bell housing and drop it down. You can see I've got my cardboard piece on here to keep anything from falling in the transmission. Got my little chain bolted to the top of the transmission. My chain fall up here. I didn't have a 4x4, so I screwed together two 2x4s. It hangs, out the back window there and onto my dashboard. I still got another little block of wood. It's sitting on top of my gauge cluster, but that's pretty heavy duty. It'll hold it up. And I still got a block of wood behind it. Got my little chain around there. So I'm going to go underneath. I've got tension on this chain here, holding the transmission up. Everything's loose. I got about 6 bolts on the bottom of the bell housing. So I'll get those loose. And then I'll come up here and wriggle the transmission loose, get it out of the pilot bearing and clutch, and then we'll lower it down. And we'll come back and we'll probably show that as I'm doing it. Okay, we're getting ready to lower this guy down. There's tension on it. You can see it's spinning. Got to get it out a little more. Okay, she's out. Let's see if we can start lowering it down. Of course, I got my chainsaw here. Okay, everything's loose. Lower it down to the little cart I got down there, and we'll roll it out from under the truck. Okay, there we go. You can see the clutch and pressure plate there. Relatively dry, so Hopefully the clutch isn't too contaminated with any oil. It's not been slipping, so that may be a good thing. We'll get this thing rolled out from under the truck here. Well, there it is, out from under the truck. Got it on my little dolly. So it rolled right out perfectly and cleared. So I really don't need to do anything to that. I'll probably spray it down and clean it up a little bit, but you know, I rebuilt this just about a year and a half ago, so it's good inside and out. No leaks, everything runs good. So we'll get into taking the pressure plate and clutch out now. Getting ready to pull the pressure plate off. I got my clutch alignment tool in there to keep the clutch in place. I've had that thing since the early 70s. One of those Calvan things. It's got a little tapered piece in here. You screw on the right piece to size the pilot bearing, and that fits in there, and then you slide that tapered piece in there and it centers the clutch. So you definitely need that when you're reassembling it, but I'm putting it in there now just to keep the clutch from dropping down once I loosen up the pressure plate. Well, we got the clutch and pressure plate out. You can see the clutch here. It's not contaminated at all. Good and dry. Pressure plate's dry. So everything's good there. Got the flywheel. Look at the flywheel. Let me crawl back up under here and show you that. See the flywheel there. It's dry. I had it turned the last time I had it off, so it's good and flat. You can see where I marked across the bolts to see if they've backed out. If I ever pulled it down again, all of them are still in the exact same place. I put blue Loctite on them when I put them in originally. Another thing that I did, if you don't know, this flywheel only goes on one way. So what I did was I put some punch marks on the flywheel and a few little punch marks there on the crankshaft so that I can line it up. I made myself a stud. It goes in the top hole. So I put that on there and I put the flywheel on there, and then I can get it in. It'll be sure it's in the right place when I put it on. So I'm about ready to take the flywheel off, and we'll see what that seal looks like behind it. Well, just for the hell of it, I wanted to see what this flywheel weighed. I put it on my scale. It comes in just about 125 pounds. So that's pretty hefty. It's all my little old skinny ass wanted to wrestle up and down out of the truck for sure. But anyway, so I got it out, and I'm not really sure what my problem is. The seal doesn't look too bad under there. I'm going to get under there and show you that in a minute. I'm thinking it may be the carrier behind the housing, which is a much bigger problem. Okay, here we are looking into the back of the crankshaft. This is my stud here that I put to wrestle the flywheel out on, and I'll use that when I put the flywheel back in. That's my little punch marks that I told you I put on the crank, and I have some corresponding punch marks on the flywheel so that it goes back on the same way. Well, I was getting some leaking. I can't tell if all that's coming from right around the seal or not. It looks like I've got some seepage around where the seal goes into the housing, but I don't know if that's just where it's flying around or whether it's leaking out. So I'm going to pull the seal out here, see what I can see. I mean, it's wet all the way around. but I was expecting to see a lot more seepage right here than I did, and it's not as bad as I thought. Of course, the whole inside of this bell housing here is got oil on it, so I'm definitely gonna be putting some brake clean in that. But if I have to pull that off, that's gonna be a problem. That actually holds up the back of the engine. Of course, I got to pull the starter off, and you know, the motor mounts right there. So I'll have to support the engine and jack it up a little bit. But in talking to Garrett, he said what I have to do when I put it back on is put a dial indicator here and center it to the crankshaft. And this thing looks pretty heavy. I don't know how I would do that, but you know, if that's what's got to be done, that's what's got to be done. If I have to take it out, I'll probably go ahead and change the motor mounts while I'm at it. But other than that, we'll have to see how it goes. I'm gonna send this picture to Garrett and see what he thinks if I need to pull it off. He's the Deuce guru, so he's out of the country right this minute, but he and I text and talk quite often, so we'll see how it goes. I'll come back when I've got the seal pulled out. All right, guys, I think I figured out what my problem is. Remember, I had these two empty holes here. I got to talking to both Garrett and Mike Verrilli of Big Mike's Motor Pool, and we've come to the conclusion that those bolts should be in there. And Mike sent me some pictures of a junk engine that he had with the flywheel off, and the bolts were in there. I was concerned that there would not be enough clearance between the head of the bolt and the back of the flywheel. I took some measurements with, you know, calipers and micrometers, and it looks like there's about 3/32 of an inch clearance. And then to prove it even further, I put some putty on the end of these bolts, and then put the flywheel on, tightened it down, pulled it back off, and it never squashed the putty, so I know it's enough clearance back there. When I put the bolts in, obviously I put blue Loctite on them, and then I put the gray gasket sealant on the shoulder of the bolt and under the head of the bolt, and I tightened those down and torqued them down. And when I did, oil weeped out of the gasket that's back there. So I dried that off and cleaned it with brake cleaner, and I came back with a light coat of that gray gasket sealer all the way around where the block meets the seal carrier. So, well, I believe what was happening is oil was wicking up through that gasket, getting in these oil holes, and then running down in my bell housing. The seal was perfect. The seal, you know, the edge of the crankshaft is perfectly clean. There were no wear marks on the seal or anything. So I'm going to replace the new seal. I'm going to put some of the gasket sealer around the edge of the seal when I press it in. And obviously I'm going to oil the seal when it goes around the crank to be sure I don't bend the lip back or anything. And then I'll sit that in there and we'll put the flywheel back on. So that's what I found. I finally found in the TM, and it showed a picture where these bolts were in. So whoever worked on the engine previous to me left these bolts out. And when I got the truck, it had a little bit of a rear main leak. It wasn't too bad. And obviously when I replaced the clutch and pressure plate and everything, I went ahead and replaced that seal. Well, less than 1,000 miles later, I'm dripping again. So I pulled it back out, and I think I found a problem there. So hopefully this clears it up. There was no oil anywhere else coming in, you know, so hopefully this takes care of it. Well, I got my parts that I ordered from Big Mike's Motor Pool. There's my new seal. Looks just like the old one. I got a transmission top cover gasket. Like I said, I had to take that off to get the transmission out from under the truck. I got the adapter to flywheel cover gasket. And while I was in here, I'm going to go ahead and change my rear motor mounts. You know, they're right there where I'm at, so I'm going to go ahead and replace those guys. So Mike sent me those. So Mike's always good with the parts. If you don't see what he has on the website, email him. He usually has a lot of stuff that's not necessarily showing in stock on his website, and he's a great source for technical support. You email him with a question, text him, and he'll get right back with you. And like I said, he was instrumental in helping me figure out if I needed those bolts in there or not. And so we're going to put these parts in and continue reassembling the truck. Well, this is my method of getting the flywheel back on. As you can see, I've got a couple pieces of paracord tied through the vent holes there in the flywheel. I've got it so that my orientation punch marks are where it should be, and my alignment pin dowel goes in there. So once I lift it up high enough with the chain fall, I'll get it on the alignment pin, slide it back, and then I can disconnect the paracord and push it back to where it's on the crank and bolt it up. I'm definitely not going to be under this thing. If it falls, it'll cripple me. So we definitely don't want that to happen. So pull the right chain here. I'll get this thing going up. Once it gets up in there, I still got to wrestle it around a little bit, but the weight will be all on the chain fall. No way I could pick this thing up any other way. All right, I'll show you when I got it on. All right, I got that guy up in there. Got 3 bolts started just to align it. You can see I got my punch marks here, aligned with the punch marks on the crank. And like I said, it'll only go on one way. So it's important when you pull this guy off to mark it. You can either put some paint or something. I just did a couple punch marks, and the stud makes it a whole lot easier to get everything lined up. So I'm going to put some blue Loctite on those flywheel bolts, and they torque down in 2 sequences. The first sequence you torque them down to about 80-90 foot-pounds, then you come back and torque them to 115-120 foot-pounds. But definitely put blue Loctite on those guys. You don't want them coming loose. I got the pressure plate flywheel back in. Used my alignment tool to get that back centered up, and got the bolts back in. I also used a stud on each side so I could slide the pressure plate in without having to wrestle it to get the bolts lined up. So we got the pressure plate all in, torqued down. They're like 25 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and change the motor mounts now. You can see I've got the bottom mount off of the screw, and on this side I got the bottom mount off of the screw. It's a 3/4 nut, and the head of the bolt is a 1 inch. That's kind of unusual, but so I have to take off the accelerator linkage here to get that bolt to come up so I can get this top mount out. And of course I've got to jack the engine up about, not very much, just enough to clear that mount. So I'll get that out. And obviously the most important thing is never get your fingers in between here, is if the jack should fail or fall, that 1,600-pound rear end of the motor would fall down and crush your fingers, and there you'd be. So I got to rig up probably a 4x4 and a jack under here and jack that thing up. Maybe, I'm thinking maybe no more than a 1/2 inch. And I'll get that mount out and put the new mounts in, lower it down and tighten it up. And then I'll be ready to start putting the transmission back in. I'm getting ready to put the transmission in. You can see I've got a couple studs here in the adapter ring to help align the transmission. Obviously I have to get the pilot, the input shaft and the pilot bearing lined up, but the rotation, those studs will help align that. I got it on my chain fall down under the truck, and we'll start pulling it up, and hopefully it'll line up relatively easy. I left the transmission in 5th gear so that I can spin the shaft, and if the clutch needs to be aligned, the input shaft needs to be aligned to the clutch, I can turn the tail stock relatively easy and and get it aligned in there, and then hopefully it'll go in with some ease. Famous last words. Well, as you can see, I got the transmission back installed. It was a little bit of difficulty there, but you know, anytime you're doing it by yourself, you know, you need 3 more hands. So anyway, I got it up in there, bolted up, engaged, everything's good. I just filled the transmission up with, refilled it with oil. I'm getting ready to put the cover back on it with the gasket. And then what I'm going to do, before I button anything up or even put the jack shaft back in, I'm going to start it up and be sure it, you know, engages all the gears and turns in the right direction. Now I know when I put it in neutral and start the engine, the shaft is still going to turn because there's friction just on the shaft, and you know, between the clutch and flywheel there's air moving and whatnot, so I know that shaft's going to be turning even when it's in neutral. So before I start it, I'm going to put it in neutral and be sure the shaft does turn, and so I'll know that it's in neutral. And then I'm going to start it up, and I'm going to make sure it turns the right directions and all that stuff when I run it, and make sure I don't hear any crazy noises or anything, because I don't want to get it all buttoned up and then have to do something again. So that's the plan. All right, I got the transmission cover back on. That's not easy by yourself either. It's kind of heavy. You got to have one arm moving the shifter arms to sit up into the slots on the synchronizer while you're holding it up. So that was a little bit of a pain, but right now I'm in neutral, and I can spin the shaft, so I know I'm really in neutral. And we'll start the truck up. I've got my 5-gallon bucket there for a seat, so I'm going to start it up. There's no air in the truck, so we got to put up with the buzzer, but that's all right. And as I said, I knew the shaft would turn. See if I can do this with one hand. Got the clutch in. Okay, I don't know what happened. My phone stopped recording there. So we push the clutch in. I'll go to first gear. Let the clutch out. And we see it's turning. That's great. Push the clutch back in. Do the reverse. That's going the correct direction. Clutch in. Second gear. That's good. Third gear. Fourth gear. Fifth gear. Okay, that's all good. No strange noises. Everything's turning in the correct direction. So that's good. So next I'll be putting the jack shaft back in, which in my opinion is the most difficult part of taking the transmission out of these trucks. But that's what I'm going to start on next. Well, I got the jack shaft back in, and I ran the truck for a little while, as you saw earlier. I backed it out here in the driveway so I could wash the floor out and everything before I put the seats back in. It's amazing how much dirt accumulates in here. But anyway, washed that out, scrubbed it out. I'm going to pull it back into my garage there and put the tunnels back on, put the seats in. Then I'm going to take it for a little bit longer test drive. So far, no weeping oil, no seeping oil, no nothing, so that's good. But I'll take it on a longer test drive today, and we'll see how it all comes out. Wish me luck. All right, we're going to take this thing on a little test drive here. about it. We're going to check and see underneath and see if it's still dry. You can see I still got the inspection plate off. I left that off on purpose. But everything is still dry. You know, I washed everything off with brake cleaner and everything. It's still dry. Stuck my fingers all up in the inspection hole and felt around. Everything's dry because that was just a short little trip. But I'll be monitoring it and seeing how everything is going. And, you know, if I have more problem, I certainly will be letting you guys know. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. And see you next time.